The statistics are almost impossible to comprehend. Approximately 17 million people died, both military and civilian. Another 23 million were wounded. Entire villages in France and Belgium were erased from the map. Northern France looked like a moonscape, cratered and poisoned, littered with unexploded ordnance that still kills people today, over a century later. The lost generation became a term for the young men who either died in the war or survived it psychologically destroyed. Britain lost 700,000 soldiers, France 1.4 million, Russia perhaps 2 million, Germany 2 million. Colonial troops from Africa and Asia died far from home for empires that ruled over them. The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919, spread partly by troop movements, killed perhaps 50 million more worldwide, more than the war itself. 4 empires collapsed: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman. The map of Europe was redrawn. New nations appeared: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. In the Middle East, Britain and France divided up the former Ottoman territories, drawing borders that ignored ethnic and religious realities, decisions that continue to cause conflict today. The peace was formalized in the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. The negotiations were dominated by the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Giorgia Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Wilson brought his 14 points, an idealistic vision for a new world order based on self-determination, free trade, disarmament, and a League of Nations to preserve peace. Some of these principles were incorporated into the treaty, but harsh realities intervened. Clemenceau, representing a France devastated by 4 years of occupation and fighting on its own soil, wanted revenge and security. He famously said, "America is far away, protected by the ocean. Britain could not be blockaded. We are neither of these things. I lived through 1870 when the Prussians besieged Paris. I don't want to live through that again." The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, the infamous War Guilt Clause. Germany had to pay enormous reparations, give up all its colonies, surrender territory to France, Poland, and other neighbors, and reduce its military to a token force. The German delegation wasn't allowed to negotiate. They were presented with the terms and told to sign or face invasion. When the terms became known in Germany, there was outrage. Germans felt betrayed. Their army hadn't been defeated on German soil. How could this be? The stab-in-the-back myth took hold. The idea that the German military had been winning but was betrayed by politicians and revolutionaries at home. This poisonous lie would fuel extremism in the years to come. Many historians argue that the Treaty of Versailles was neither lenient enough to reconcile Germany nor harsh enough to permanently weaken it. It left Germany bitter and resentful, but still powerful enough to eventually challenge the settlement. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who attended the conference, resigned in protest and wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace, warning that the reparations would destroy Germany's economy and create conditions for future conflict. He was right. The League of Nations was established, Wilson's great hope for preventing future wars. But the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, meaning the United States never joined the League. Without American participation, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions. It would prove largely ineffective in the crises of the 1930s.
Let's step back from the grand strategy in politics to consider what this war meant for ordinary people. Because in the end, wars aren't fought by nations or ideologies, they're fought by human beings. Consider a British soldier named Harry Patch. He was conscripted at age 18 and sent to the Passchendaele battlefield in 1917. In September of that year, a German shell exploded near his position. 3 of his friends were killed instantly. Harry was wounded and evacuated. He survived, lived to 111 years old, the last surviving combat veteran of World War I. Before he died in 2009, he said, "War isn't worth one life." Or think about the French soldier, Maurice Genevoix, who fought in 1914 and was severely wounded. He spent years writing about his experiences, describing the camaraderie among soldiers, the terror of battle, the surreal moments of beauty in the midst of horror. His books helped France understand what its soldiers had endured. Consider the families, wives who received telegrams saying their husbands were missing, mothers who lost multiple sons, children who grew up without fathers. In France, there was a generation of women who would never marry because there simply weren't enough men of their age group left alive. The physical scars were everywhere. Towns across Europe erected war memorials listing the dead. In small British villages, these lists could include dozens of names, a staggering percentage of the young male population. In France, entire regions remained uninhabitable, the soil too contaminated, too filled with unexploded munitions. The psychological scars ran even deeper. Shell-shocked veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Many suffered what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, inability to hold jobs or maintain relationships. Some ended up homeless or in asylums. Others just tried to forget, refusing to talk about the war for the rest of their lives. Artists and writers tried to process the trauma. The war poets, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, John McCrae, gave voice to the horror. Owen's poem, Dulce et decorum est, brutally mocked the old Latin saying that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Describing a gas attack victim, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. Owen was killed in action 1 week before the armistice. His mother received the telegram informing her of his death as church bells rang to celebrate the war's end. The lost generation of writers, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, were shaped by the war's disillusionment. Hemingway, who served as an ambulance driver, wrote novels like A Farewell to Arms that captured the sense of meaning collapsing. The old certainties, honor, glory, patriotism, seemed like lies after the mechanized slaughter of the trenches. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, published in 1929, gave the German perspective. It told the story of young German soldiers who enlisted enthusiastically and were destroyed by the war. The book was later banned and burned by the Nazis, who hated its anti-war message. Women's roles changed dramatically. With men at the front, women took on jobs previously reserved for men: factory work, driving ambulances, even some military support roles. British women served in organizations like the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Russian women fought in combat units. After the war, women in many countries gained the right to vote, partly in recognition of their wartime contributions. But for colonial subjects who'd fought for European empires, the promises made during the war often proved empty. African and Asian soldiers who'd shed blood for Britain, France, and other colonial powers found that independence and equality remained distant dreams. In some cases, such as India, wartime service increased nationalist sentiment. If Indians were good enough to die for the British Empire, why weren't they good enough to govern themselves? World War I didn't end conflicts. In many ways, it created new ones or exacerbated old ones.
Let's trace some of the threads that led from 1918 to 1939 and the Second World War. In Germany, the Weimar Republic, the democratic government established after the Kaiser's abdication, struggled from the beginning. Blamed for accepting the shameful Treaty of Versailles, weakened by economic problems, and attacked from both the far left and far right, it never gained solid legitimacy. Hyperinflation in 1923 destroyed the savings of the middle class. People carried money in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread. The currency became worthless. Although things stabilized in the mid-1920s, the Great Depression hit Germany hard. Unemployment soared. Into this chaos came Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler was a World War I veteran, wounded and decorated. He blamed Germany's defeat on Jews, communists, and weak politicians. His message of restoring German greatness resonated with a population that felt humiliated. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor, and within months he'd established a dictatorship. Hitler's foreign policy aimed to overturn the Treaty of Versailles. He rearmed Germany in violation of the treaty, remilitarized the Rhineland, and pursued aggressive expansion. The League of Nations proved powerless to stop him. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, World War II began, a conflict even more destructive than the first. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution led to civil war between the Reds, communists, and Whites, anti-communists, with foreign intervention from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, who feared communism spreading. The Reds won, and under Lenin and then Stalin, the Soviet Union became a totalitarian state. Stalin's purges and forced collectivization killed millions. The ideological conflict between communism and capitalism, between the Soviet Union and the West, would dominate the second half of the 20th century, another legacy of World War I. In Italy, disillusionment with the mutilated victory — Italy didn't get all the territory it was promised for joining the Allies — led to political instability. Benito Mussolini's fascists took power in 1922, establishing a totalitarian regime that would ally with Hitler. In the Middle East, the borders drawn by Britain and France ignored ethnic and religious communities. The British had made contradictory promises during the war, to Arabs promising independence, to Jews through the Balfour Declaration promising a homeland in Palestine, and to France agreeing to divide the region between them. These contradictions created lasting resentments. The French took Syria and Lebanon as mandates. The British took Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. Local populations weren't consulted. In Iraq, Britain cobbled together 3 Ottoman provinces, one predominantly Shia, one Sunni, one Kurdish, and installed a Hashemite king. The artificial nature of these states contributed to instability that persists today. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, the secret 1916 deal between Britain and France to divide the Ottoman Empire, became a symbol of Western betrayal. Arab nationalists and later Islamist movements would point to it as evidence that the West couldn't be trusted. In Turkey, the harsh terms proposed for the Ottoman Empire led to a nationalist revolution led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He defeated Greek forces trying to claim territory in Anatolia, expelled foreign occupiers, and established the Republic of Turkey in 1923, abolishing the Ottoman Sultanate. Turkey was the one defeated power that successfully resisted the peace settlement. In China, resentment over the Treaty of Versailles, which gave German concessions in China to Japan rather than returning them to China, sparked the May 4th movement, a cultural and political revolution that shaped modern Chinese nationalism. The sense of betrayal by the Western powers fed into the rise of both the nationalist and communist movements in China.
So what did World War I accomplish? What did all that suffering achieve? If the goal was to make the world safe for democracy, as Wilson claimed, it failed. By the late 1930s, much of Europe was under totalitarian rule. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Soviet Russia, authoritarian regimes in Spain, Portugal, and much of Eastern Europe. Democracy survived mainly in Western Europe and North America. If the goal was to end war, it obviously failed catastrophically. World War II began just 21 years after World War I ended, killing even more people and introducing new horrors like the Holocaust and nuclear weapons. If the goal was stability, it failed. The interwar period was marked by economic crisis, political extremism, and recurring international tensions. And yet, World War I did transform the world in profound ways, for better and worse. It accelerated technological change, aviation, radio communications, medical advances like blood transfusions and plastic surgery, even everyday items like stainless steel and tea bags, all were developed or improved because of the war. It changed social structures. The old aristocratic order, already declining, lost its remaining prestige. Millions of working-class men who'd fought as soldiers weren't willing to return to their proper place after the war. Women who'd worked in factories and offices weren't all willing to return exclusively to domestic roles. Class hierarchies loosened, though they didn't disappear. It reshaped the global balance of power. Europe, which had dominated the world in 1914, was devastated and weakened. The United States emerged as a major power, though it retreated into isolationism in the 1920s and 1930s. Japan expanded its influence in Asia. The seeds of decolonization were planted. It would take another world war to fully grow them, but the process began with World War I. The war raised profound questions about meaning, morality, and human nature that we're still grappling with. How could supposedly civilized nations commit such carnage? What happened to the optimism and faith in progress that had characterized the pre-war world? Philosophers and theologians struggled with these questions. The easy certainties of the 19th century were gone. The war also created a powerful anti-war movement. Never again became a rallying cry. Organizations promoting peace and international cooperation proliferated. Pacifism gained intellectual respectability in a way it hadn't before. The horror of World War I inspired genuine attempts to prevent future conflicts, even if those attempts ultimately failed. Veterans movements emerged, trying to care for the wounded and disabled, to honor the dead, and to ensure that societies remembered the cost of war. Remembrance Day or Veterans Day on November 11th, the wearing of poppies, war memorials in every town. These rituals of memory were ways of saying, this mattered. These people mattered. We must not forget. The phrase, the war to end all wars, is often quoted ironically now, given what came after, but it reflected a genuine hope that the horror had been so great that humanity would never allow such a thing to happen again. That hope was naive, but it was real.
Let me share a few more personal stories, because they bring home the human reality of this vast historical event better than any statistics can. There was a Christmas truce in 1914, one of the most remarkable events of the war. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers began singing Christmas carols. British soldiers responded with carols of their own. Then, tentatively, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons as souvenirs. They showed each other photographs of their families. They played impromptu football matches. For a brief moment, the enemies remembered they were all human beings. Officers on both sides were horrified and quickly shut down the truces. It never happened on the same scale again. But it showed that even in the midst of this industrial horror, humanity persisted. There was a French soldier named Apollinaire, a poet and art critic who'd volunteered for service. He was wounded in 1916 by shell fragments that penetrated his helmet. He survived, though weakened, and continued writing. His wartime poems captured the strange beauty and terror of the front. He died in the influenza pandemic in 1918, just days before the armistice. His last words were reportedly, "I want to live." There was Edith Cavell, a British nurse working in Belgium when the Germans invaded. She helped Allied soldiers escape to neutral Netherlands, knowing the risk. The Germans arrested her in 1915 and executed her by firing squad. Her death became a propaganda coup for the Allies, but she wasn't interested in propaganda. Before her execution, she said, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone." Consider the story of Ernst Jünger, a German soldier who fought on the Western Front throughout the war, was wounded multiple times, and survived. After the war, he wrote Storm of Steel, a memoir that was unusual in presenting the war without strong anti-war sentiment. He described combat as terrible, but also exhilarating, transformative. His perspective, controversial then and now, reminded people that reactions to war were complex and individual. Jünger lived to 102, dying in 1998, having witnessed nearly the entire 20th century. There was the story of the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment, African-American soldiers from New York who fought with distinction in the French Army. The U.S. Army, still segregated, didn't want them in combat roles. They spent 191 days in frontline trenches, more than any other American unit, and never lost a man to capture or a foot of ground to the enemy. They returned home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens, but they'd proven their courage and ability beyond any doubt. Think about the experience of someone like Vera Brittain, a British woman who became a nurse during the war. Her fiancé, her brother, and two close friends were all killed. Her memoir, Testament of Youth, described the grief and the destruction of her entire social circle. Yet she went on to become a writer and peace activist, channeling her pain into advocacy for a better world. There were countless stories like these, of bravery and cowardice, cruelty and compassion, hope and despair. The war contained multitudes of human experiences, and each person who lived through it carried their own story.
How do we remember World War I today, over a century after the guns fell silent? In Britain, the poppy became a symbol of remembrance, inspired by John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields, which described poppies growing among the graves in Belgium and France. Every November, Britons wear poppies to honor the fallen. France and Belgium preserve sections of the Western Front as memorials. You can visit Verdun and see the battlefield, still scarred and cratered. You can walk through preserved trenches. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme bears the names of 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died in the Somme battles and have no known grave. Think about that number. 72,000 men, so completely destroyed that their bodies were never identified or found. That's just one memorial, just British and South African soldiers, just from the Somme. There are dozens of such memorials across France and Belgium. In Australia and New Zealand, Anzac Day on April 25th commemorates the Gallipoli landings. It's become their most important national day of remembrance, defining their national identity as much as Independence Day defines America. In Germany, remembrance is more complicated. The war dead are honored,
But the toxic mythology that grew around World War I, the stab-in-the-back legend that fed Nazism, makes simple commemoration difficult. Germans remember their soldiers' suffering while also grappling with how their defeat led to even worse horrors. In many former colonies, India, Africa, the Caribbean, the contribution of colonial soldiers is increasingly recognized. For decades, their service was overlooked or minimized. The Indian Army, for instance, contributed 1.5 million men to the war effort. Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers fought and died in Europe and in Africa itself. Recognizing their sacrifice is part of a broader reckoning with colonial history. In recent years, historians have worked to recover overlooked stories of women's contributions, of colonial soldiers, of the home front, of resistance to the war. The narrative has expanded beyond the trenches of the Western Front to encompass the global nature of the conflict. The last veterans of World War I have all now passed away. Harry Patch, whom I mentioned earlier, died in 2009. Florence Green, the last veteran of any nationality, died in 2012 at age 110. She'd served in the Royal Air Force as a waitress in officers' messes. With their passing, we've lost the last direct link to the war. It's now entirely history, no longer living memory. This makes remembrance both more difficult and more important. Without living witnesses, how do we keep the lessons alive? How do we make real to new generations what that war meant?
So here we are at the end of our journey through World War I. We've covered the causes, that powder keg of alliances, nationalism, and imperial competition. We've witnessed the assassination that lit the fuse and the crisis that escalated into continental war. We've walked through the trenches, experienced the horror of new weapons, seen empires collapse and new nations born. We've traced the course of the conflict from the opening shots to the final armistice, from the Western Front to the Middle East, from the seas to the skies. We've counted the dead, 17 million, and acknowledged that behind that number are 17 million individual stories of lives cut short. We've seen how the peace that followed planted the seeds for another, even more destructive war. And we've reflected on what this all means, how we remember it, and what lessons, if any, we can draw from it. What are those lessons? Here are some thoughts, though you might draw different conclusions. First, wars are easier to start than to stop. That fatal summer of 1914 showed how quickly a crisis can spiral out of control, how alliance systems can turn a regional conflict into a global catastrophe. Once the machine of war starts running, stopping it becomes almost impossible. Millions of men were mobilized in a matter of days. Stopping that mobilization would have been seen as weakness, as military disaster. So, the momentum toward war became unstoppable. Second, technology changes warfare faster than doctrine adapts. The generals of 1914 were trained for wars of movement, cavalry charges, and offensive spirit. They got machine guns, artillery, barbed wire, and trenches. It took years of horrific casualties before tactics caught up with technology. We see this pattern repeat in every major conflict. The last war's lessons applied to new war's realities. Third, the costs of war are always underestimated. Everyone in 1914 thought it would be over quickly. No one imagined 4 years of slaughter. No one predicted the complete transformation of society, the collapse of empires, the traumatization of a generation. Wars have consequences that ripple forward for decades. Fourth, peace is as important as victory. The Treaty of Versailles was a victor's peace, imposed rather than negotiated, designed to punish rather than reconcile. It created resentments that poisoned international relations for 2 decades.
a harsh peace is not necessarily a lasting peace. Fifth, we must remember the humanity behind the history. It's easy to talk about strategies and statistics, armies and nations, but World War I was fought by individual human beings. Teenagers who left farms and factories, who wrote letters home to mothers and sweethearts, who felt fear and cold and hunger, who dreamed of survival and home. They weren't abstract soldiers, they were people. Remembering that is how we honor them. And perhaps the most important lesson, war is not inevitable. It's not natural law. The First World War was not predestined by some historical force. It resulted from choices. Choices to value honor over peace, military mobilization over diplomacy, alliance obligations over restraint. Different choices might have produced a different outcome. November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. A French soldier named Augustin Trebuchet was carrying a message to his company. The message said that hot soup would be available after 11:30 a.m. At 10:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the armistice, he was shot and killed by German machine gun fire. He was the last French soldier to die in World War I. On the German side, Lieutenant Thomas was killed at 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before the ceasefire, leading a patrol. These men died pointlessly, minutes before the killing stopped. Their deaths encapsulate the absurdity and tragedy of the war, even at the very end, with peace just moments away. The machine of war kept grinding. But at 11 a.m., the guns did fall silent. Along hundreds of miles of front, men who'd been trying to kill each other climbed out of their trenches. Some cheered, some wept. Many just sat in stunned silence, unable to process that they'd survived, that it was over. A German soldier later described the moment. The sudden silence was uncanny. For the first time in 4 years, I could hear birds singing. The war that was supposed to end all wars was over. The world it created, our world, was just beginning. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of World War I. The Great War changed everything: politics, society, culture, technology. It destroyed an old world and created a new one. Understanding it helps us understand the century that followed and the world we live in today. Those millions who died in the trenches, in the skies, on the seas, they deserve to be remembered not just as casualties of war, but as people who lived, who hoped, who mattered. Their sacrifice, whether in a just cause or a futile one, was real. Their suffering was real. Their humanity was real. And perhaps if we remember them well, we can honor them best by working to ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again.